All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. We're jumping into something kind of interesting today, some brand new analysis that really takes a look at cannabis use and heart health.
Yeah, and in ways that a lot of folks might not be expecting.
I think that's a really good way to put it. So we've got this study hot off the presses, literally published March 18th, 2025 in JCC Advances, which, as many of you know, is a pretty well-respected cardiology journal.
Absolutely, and I think that's why this particular study has been generating so much buzz.
It's really making us rethink some things. And for this deep dive, we really want to get to the bottom of what this new research is telling us about potential heart risks, especially for younger adults who use cannabis. We're talking about people who might otherwise consider themselves perfectly healthy.
Right, it really throws a wrench into some of those common assumptions we have about who's at risk for heart problems.
So to set the stage, let's talk about who is actually involved in this study.
Sure. So the researchers had a pretty good sized group to work with. There were 93,267 cannabis users, and they compared them to a massive group of 4.5 million non-users.
4.5 million, that's a lot of people.
It is. And here's the kicker. Everyone in the study was under 50 years old, and they had no history of major heart problems when they started. No high blood pressure, no diabetes, no previous heart attacks or anything like that.
So we're talking about a pretty healthy group overall, at least at the beginning. That kind of begs the question, how did they make sure they were comparing apples to apples, so to speak?
That's a great question, and it's a big reason why this study is so strong. They used a technique called propensity score matching.
Okay, I gotta be honest, that sounds a little intimidating. Break it down for me.
Basically, it's a statistical way to make sure the two groups you're comparing are as similar as possible, even though they're different in some ways. In this case, they statistically matched each cannabis user to a non-user who had really similar characteristics in terms of things like blood pressure, diabetes, even tobacco use. So it's like they created these mirror images, these statistical twins, to control for those other factors.
Exactly, and that's why the results carry so much weight. Because by controlling for all those other variables, they can be more certain that any differences they see in heart health outcomes are actually linked to the cannabis use itself.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now let's get to the heart of the matter. What were the most important findings? What stood out to you?
Honestly, some of the numbers were pretty shocking, even for me. They found that cannabis users had a 6.2 times higher odds of having a heart attack than the non-users.
6 times. That's huge.
Yeah, and it's not just about the relative risk. We got to look at the absolute risk, too.
Right, right. Put that into perspective for us. What are we talking about in terms of actual chances of having a heart attack?
For the cannabis users, the absolute risk was 0.56%. Now, that might sound small, but when you compare it to the non-users who had a risk of just 0.09%, that's where you see that 6.2 times higher risk come into play. Wow, that's a pretty stark difference. And if I remember correctly, heart attacks weren't the only concern, were they?
Absolutely not. The study also found a significantly increased risk of stroke. Cannabis users were 4.3 times more likely to have a stroke than non-users.
So we're talking about two major life-altering events. What were the absolute risks for stroke in both groups?
For users, it was 0.41%, and for non-users, it was only 0.09%.
So again, even though the absolute numbers might seem small, the difference between the two groups is really striking. Did they find anything about other types of heart issues less traumatic than a full-blown heart attack or stroke?
Yeah, actually, they found that cannabis users had about twice the odds of developing heart failure. So we're talking about a risk of 0.86% for users versus 0.42% for non-users. And then when they kind of zoomed out and looked at the overall combined risk of any major cardiovascular event, including heart attack, stroke, or death from any heart-related cause, the difference was even bigger. Cannabis users had a 3.3 times higher risk.
So putting all of that together, it paints a pretty concerning picture. And I understand they took things a step further and looked at how this affected survival over time.
Exactly. They used what's called a Kaplan-Meier analysis, which is just a fancy way of looking at how likely people are to survive over a certain period without having a major heart problem. Well, the cannabis users had a significantly lower probability of staying heart healthy compared to the non-users.
So this isn't just about a one-time risk. It seems like there could be long-term consequences as well. And this is where it gets really interesting for me. Do we have any clues about why cannabis might be tied to these increased risks?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Now, this specific study didn't dig into the exact biological reasons why, but there's some promising research out there that suggests a few possibilities. For instance, some studies have linked cannabis use to something called endothelial dysfunction, which basically means that the inner lining of your blood vessels isn't working as well as it should. and that can lead to all sorts of problems.
So it's like the plumbing in your circulatory system isn't as smooth and efficient as it could be.
Exactly. And there's more. Cannabis use has also been associated with increased levels of these things called pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are basically molecules that cause inflammation throughout your body.
And we know that chronic inflammation is linked to a bunch of health issues, heart disease being one of them.
Right. And then there's oxidative stress, which is another thing that can damage cells and contribute to heart problems. Some research suggests that cannabis use might increase oxidative stress, but it's important to remember that all of this is still being explored. This new study highlights a strong association, but we need more research to really nail down the precise causes.
Okay, so we've got a big red flag here, but the why is still kind of a puzzle.
You got it. It's a work in progress.
So for all of you listening out there, what's the big takeaway here? What should we be thinking about?
I think the big takeaway is that we need to be more aware of the potential heart risks associated with cannabis use, even in people who are young and don't have other obvious risk factors for heart disease. For a long time, the focus has been on the potential benefits of cannabis, and rightfully so, but this study shows that we can't ignore the possible downsides either, especially when it comes to something as important as heart health.
So to sum it all up, this new analysis suggests that even if you're young and you feel healthy, using cannabis could increase your risk of some serious heart problems down the road.
Yeah. And until we have a better understanding of the underlying causes, we need to take these findings very seriously.
It definitely makes you pause and think, especially given how common cannabis use is becoming these days.
So that's it for today's deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but it really just scratches the surface. Given what we've learned today, what are the important questions to consider about the potential long-term impact of cannabis use on our cardiovascular health, even if we don't have those traditional risk factors? That's something for all of us to chew on. Until next time.